On the morning of October 2nd, America woke to reports of what would become the worst mass shooting in the modern history of the country. As we stared into the faces of the recently deceased over our morning coffee, the same questions and ponderings we've heard dozens of times before raised their tired heads. The bodies were barely cold before politicians and pundits began using the event as a springboard for their personal agenda. Hillary Clinton wasted no time making a fool of herself by displaying her complete ignorance of what a silencer, or more accurately, a suppressor, actually does. Late-night show hosts weighed in on the subject, with most, if not all of them, offering emotional pleas for heavier weapons restrictions, as if anyone asked for their highly unqualified opinion. We even have Democratic Senator Chris Murphy spouting this bit of leftist rhetoric on the Senate floor.
I know these are harsh words, but I believe it in my heart. I think there is an unintentional endorsement that gets sent to these mass murderers when after slaughter, Congress does nothing.
Unintentional endorsement. This wording calls back to the often chanted "silence is violence" line that is a favorite of leftist protesters. This sort of language attempts to put the victim's blood on the hands of Congress, as well as anyone who doesn't support the Democratic agenda of more stringent gun legislation. Hidden beneath what masquerades as common-sense gun laws is a quiet call for confiscation. Simultaneously, the Republican Party consistently insists that access to firearms plays no role in gun violence or mass shootings. So what then is true? Which tactic would be the most effective method of curbing gun violence in America? Is there truly an epidemic of mass shootings in this country? Let's attempt to rise above the political noise and the tugging of heartstrings to get a clean, undistorted look at the facts. There is no question that America has a love affair with weaponry. With the U.S. population representing only 4.4% of the globe, we still own 48% of the estimated 650 million civilian-owned guns worldwide, a fact which may be reflected in the number of mass shootings that are carried out within our borders. 90 incidents from 1966 to 2012, 31% of global mass shootings. It would be disingenuous to suggest that ready access to firearms could in no way contribute to the frequency of these events, or gun homicides in general. But how is a mass shooting defined? As of 2013 in the US, it is defined as a public shooting in which 3 or more people are shot, whether that be killed or injured. This puts the September 24th shooting, in which Emmanuel Cadegas Sampson entered a church, killing 1 and injuring 7, in the same category as the October 1st shooting by Stephen Paddock, in which 58 were killed and 489 injured. Quite a large divide, I would say. So let's put it into perspective by looking at gun violence as a whole. In 2014, there were 33,594 total firearm deaths in the United States, of which 21,386 were suicides. 11,008 were homicides, with only 14 having died under the umbrella of a mass shooting. In fact, the state with the highest firearm death rate in 2013 was Alaska, which has the 3rd lowest population in the country. The overall gun death rate between 1993 and 2000 declined by 31%, with the homicide rate nearly being cut in half. This puts to rest the persistent myth that gun violence is on the rise in this country. So how does this compare with the rest of the globe? The US has the 31st highest rate of gun homicides in the world, trailing far behind those countries with the lowest, while well ahead of those with the highest. Even still, these rates are considered significantly higher than one would expect from a country at our socioeconomic status. Getting back to mass shootings specifically, when adjusted for population, U.S. mass shooting fatalities are comparable to that of other countries that are also members of the OECD. The U.S. sits at 0.15 mass shooting fatalities per 100,000 people, a ranking lower than that of Norway, Finland, and Switzerland. Yet politicians like Hillary Clinton can still get on stage and make verifiably inaccurate and intentionally fallacious comments like this.
There have been more than 270 mass shootings in the United States this year alone. That's where 4 or more are killed.
And she wonders what happened. Since much of the debate seems to revolve around so-called assault weapons, which, by the way, is actually a made-up category and is not an official classification of any weapon type, then let's hone in on rifle deaths specifically. Of the 11,078 gun-related homicides in 2010, just over 3% of them used a rifle. In fact, death by stabbing consistently ranks higher than death by any firearm other than a handgun. Even homicides by quote-unquote other methods, which includes bare hands, has overtaken rifle deaths in recent years. So is our gun control too lenient, or are certain elements of our culture driving our desire to be armed? First, let's look at Australia, a country whose gun laws and the resulting drop in homicides and suicides have recently been held up as the gold standard. In 1996, Australia began a gun buyback system that saw the destruction of as many as 1 million weapons, resulting in their mass shooting numbers dropping to 0 over the past 20 years. It is worth noting, however, that Australia's definition of mass shootings differs drastically from ours, with 5 or more fatalities, not just injuries, needed to fit the criteria. There have been multiple shootings since the buyback that would be labeled a mass shooting had they occurred in the States, as well as a mass stabbing incident. The term buyback is essentially a way of making confiscation sound amicable. The relinquishing of the guns is still mandatory, and not complying is against the law. So when politicians assure you that they don't want weapon confiscations, yet point to Australia as a great example to follow, they are contradicting themselves. To implement a program in the United States that matches the scale of Australia's would involve the confiscation of somewhere between 60 and 100 million guns. And with America's culture and attitude towards guns, as well as a little thing called the Second Amendment, this would prove no easy task. Still, it's hard to argue with Australia's results, particularly in their suicide rate, which coincides with multiple studies that have shown that ready availability of firearms results in more suicides, with states reporting the highest number of gun ownership also reporting the highest number of suicides. But with gun death rates that have plateaued in recent years, and a steady decline happening even before the restrictions were put into place, it's difficult to actually tell how responsible these gun laws are for the dropping numbers. And how about Japan, with only 6 gun deaths in 2014, compared to our 33,000? Well, for starters, handguns are banned outright, with only shotguns and air rifles being permitted. Those looking to own a weapon must take shooting classes, pass a marksmanship test with a score of no less than 95% accuracy. You must undergo mental health and drug screenings, and even your relatives and co-workers are evaluated. And still, police can arbitrarily decide not to issue you a weapon if they so choose, even after fulfilling all the criteria. So what's the problem? For starters, Japan never developed a gun culture, with weapons being heavily restricted as soon as they entered the country. The difference of the Japanese culture in general is likely the largest factor here. It is far more homogeneous, having limited immigration in favor of isolation, and their citizens are much more submissive to power structures, unwarranted search and seizures, and an overall tighter government fist that exceeds far beyond gun control. A startling addition to this is Japan's staggering suicide rate, which is roughly 60% higher than the world average. This seems to negate the argument and studies indicating that more weapons automatically equate to more suicides, and likely once again points to more cultural differences. And what about the gun lobbyists? What about the massive campaign donations being made by the NRA to sway candidates into keeping guns in the hands of potential psychopaths? In the 2016 election cycle, the NRA did not even rank amongst the top 50 organization contributors, with donation totals not reaching much over $1 million. Compare that to the highest contributor at over $90 million. The highest recipient of NRA money in 2016 was Congressman Roy Blunt, at just under $12,000. Compare that to Tim Kaine receiving nearly $40,000 from tobacco. The NRA's lobbying numbers pale in comparison to larger organizations, with tobacco once again spending several times more. Much of the NRA's money, and I do mean much, goes not in the pockets of congressmen, but towards outside spending, mostly in an attempt to oppose Democratic candidates who advocate for stricter gun control. In 2016, over $37 million was spent in opposition of Democrats. The NRA's power lies not particularly in money, but in numbers, at over 5 million strong, and its ability to sway elections based on its large member base. Perhaps the most devastating statistic here, and one that is often drowned into silence by the over-politicization of the issue, is that of suicide. 2/3 of all gun deaths in this country are the result of self-infliction. Why is so much focus placed on rifles and their relatively small fatality rate, with only a fraction of them coming from mass shootings, when thousands die every year by their own hand? In the last 45 years, suicide rates have increased by 60% worldwide. 90% of which had some type of mental illness. In addition to this, nearly 60% of mass shootings are linked to domestic violence, with the victim being a spouse or other family members. Although it has been said dozens of times elsewhere, I am here to repeat that the problem lies not with the weapons, but with the mental health of our citizens. The list of shooters on psychoactive drugs continues to rise, most recently with Stephen Paddock having been prescribed diazepam just a few months before the Vegas shooting. Our citizens are unwell, and if we want to talk about lobbying, pharmaceutical companies have spent $900 million between 1998 and 2005, the highest in the nation. These sick people, as well as vulnerable people involved in dangerous domestic situations, must be lifted above the political agendas that permeate our conversations. The issue is not a small one, and events like the one in Vegas put an urgency in our actions, with everyone shouting above one another with a supposed solution. I began research on this video with a fairly agnostic viewpoint, and I was continually floored by the conflicting opinions and unexpected statistics that I stumbled upon. Even after observing all the data, it's still difficult to know where to stand. Things are not as cataclysmic as we're often led to believe, but there's no question that gun homicides in this country are higher than they could or should be. In general, we are in a much better place than the media-driven hysteria machine would have you believe. These tragedies are doubtlessly devastating, but be wary of anyone who claims to possess the antidote for your grievances.